Hi everybody, this is Kelly from Kelly's Creative Comforts, and today, in this tutorial I'm going to take you step by step through the process of binding your quilt. We're going to machine sew the binding on the front and hand sew the binding on the back. Now I am one of those people that actually does enjoy hand sewing my binding. It's kind of my mindless sit in front of the TV, keep my hands busy process, so I don't mind hand sewing my binding down. If you would rather machine sew your binding, then check out my other tutorial on finishing it off with machine stitching. And I also have one on applying bias binding. Today we are just going to do straight of grain binding. The only time you actually need to use a bias is if you are binding a curve of any kind, like the curve that's on a wedding ring quilt, or if you curve the corners of your quilt, then you would need to apply bias. But today we're going to be doing straight of grain. Once you have your quilt all quilted, so I have finished the quilting on this, the first step in getting ready to bind is actually to trim your quilt. So we want to take off all this excess fabric. What tends to happen is as you're sewing your binding on, this might sneak underneath and you end up sewing it into your quilt again. So we don't want to do that. So when I am trimming off my quilt, I like to leave about 1/4 of an inch away from my quilt top. I like my binding to have batting inside of it. I don't want my binding to be all smushy and have no filling. So I will line the edge of my ruler up on the edge of my quilt, the 1/4 inch mark on my ruler. I'm going to line that up on the edge of my quilt. Make sure that I'm square so that I have about 1/4 of an inch of batting still around my quilt. And then I'm just going to cut that off. There we go. And now I have a quilt that is absolutely ready to be bound. When I trim a quilt and I leave that 1/4 of an inch extra, I'm only doing that on this quilt because it is a super thin batting and I want to make sure that I have a full binding. If I am using a batting that is not as thin as this one, I will trim the quilt right to the edge of the quilt. I won't leave that extra 1/4 of an inch right there. Okay, the next thing we need to do now is figure out how many strips that we need to bind the quilt. You don't want to go short and you don't want to cut a whole lot extra that you don't need. So to figure out the math, it's not difficult, but I will put a link to it at the underneath the video so you can print it off later. The basic math is the length plus the width of your quilt times 2. That gives you the total outside perimeter measure of your quilt. Then you want to take that and add about, I usually add between 12 and 15 inches. That gives me a little bit of room for mitering my corners and the overlap that we have when we join the binding together. Then I take that total number and I divide that by 40. Now 40 is the usable width of your fabric, assuming you're using regular quilting cottons. If you're using something different like a 60-inch wide fabric or a 36-inch wide fabric, you need to divide by that number. So I'm using regular quilting cottons, which is a 40-inch usable width. And then I want to round that number up. So for an example, this quilt is 58 by 65. So I'm going to cut 7 strips of binding. Now I like to cut my binding at 2.5 inches. That's my personal preference. You will come up with your own personal preference, but I like 2.5 inches. So I'm going to cut 7 2.5 inch strips. Now the next step, once you get your strips cut, is we're going to sew them all together into one great big long strip, and that's what we're going to use for our binding. So you will notice that I haven't yet taken off my salvages. I usually take them off after I finish sewing them together, but if you want, you can just go ahead and trim off all those salvages. Then what we need to do is to mark the strips. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my ruler that has a 45-degree on it, and I'm going to line that 45-degree up right on the edge of my piece of binding, and I'm going to draw a line. And I'm doing this on the wrong side of the binding. And I'm going to do that on all of my pieces of binding. Now you'll notice the line that I drew does not include the salvage. So I went right from the tip of the salvage to the end, And you want to draw the line if you are looking at your strip, as I'm looking at mine right now, where I've got my salvage on the right-hand side. I want to go from the top right-hand corner and draw the line down towards the bottom left. Now, after you've done like miles and miles of binding like I have, you can probably just guesstimate that line. You don't have to draw the line on. But as a beginner, it's not a bad idea to draw a line on your pieces of binding. Once we get that step done, off to the sewing machine. Okay, so when I go to sew my binding together, we always sew binding on the diagonal. That spreads the seam allowance out a little bit and you don't have lumps in your binding. So I have laid out my first piece of binding is right sides up. I'm looking at the good side. I'm going to lay my second piece of binding down on top of that. And the line that I drew, I want it to be going from top left down to bottom right. You'll also notice that I have left my salvages sticking out because I haven't cut my salvages off yet. If you've cut yours off, of course, that just wouldn't be there. I also want to make sure that I am sewing right in the corner. So right where those two pieces of fabric meet, I want to be sewing right into that corner and right down into this corner. All right, so I'm going to take that and I have my needle in center needle position and I'm just going to go ahead and stitch this out. There. Now I can just leave that in and line up my next piece of binding ready to go. And I can just continue stitching until all my binding is together in one great big long piece. So now here I am at my cutting desk and I have all the binding sewn together. So now what I need to do is to trim all these down to 1/4 of an inch. So I am taking my ruler and lining it up exactly on top of those stitches. Let's just zoom in a wee bit. So there's my stitch line. Let's just mark that a little darker. There's my stitch line. And I'm going to line the 1/4 inch line on my ruler up directly on top of that line. And then I'm going to trim that off. If any of the salvage gets caught in there, I just will trim that. There we are. So now what I'm going to do, now that I have that trimmed, is I'm going to take that and I'm going to press all of these seams open. All right, so now what we want to do is we want to take the entire length of the strip and we are going to fold it wrong sides together, making sure that you have your raw edges all lined up, one on top of the other. And we are going to press all the way down the entire length of your binding strip. We do this because it just makes the binding lay so much nicer when you're putting it on, and it makes it a whole lot easier to apply. So go ahead and press the whole entire strip, and we'll see you back at the sewing machine. All right, so here we are back at the sewing machine, and I have my quilt. Now I have my machine set up for the 1/4 inch seam allowance. And what I want to do is I want to line up all the raw edges of the binding with the raw edges of my quilt, but I want to start down a few inches. I usually leave, about 4 or 5 inches that is not sewn down, so that when I get around to the other side, I can join my pieces of binding. I also don't want to start very close to a corner because I don't want to have to join my binding close to a corner. So I'm about maybe halfway down one side. And then all I'm going to do is just make sure the raw edges of my binding are laid up and lined up with the raw edges of my quilt, not that little extra piece of batting that I leave, the actual quilt itself. And I am just going to sew. Do a little back stitch and sew. Now I'm going to continue sewing all the way till I get to a corner, and I want to stop about 1/4 of an inch away from the corner. Okay, so here I am almost at the corner, and what I want to do is I want to stop 1/4 of an inch away from that corner. So what I want to do is be up about 1/4 of an inch from the end of the quilt, not the end of my batting, the end of the quilt. So I'm going to stitch right to the end, 1/4 of an inch away, and that's about 1/4 right there. We'll do like a little back stitch, and then I'm just going to break my threads. Then what I want to do is spin this. And all right, so now I've spun this, and I'm now looking at the direction I'm going to be sewing, because I'm going to be sewing in this direction. Part of the joy of binding is getting the weight of the quilt up off the floor and onto a table. If you have too much of the quilt hanging off, it's a constant fight with gravity. So what I want to do is I'm going to take this and fold it straight back. Let's see if you can see that. So that I am right into the corner here, and I've got a 45-degree angle. Then I am going to bring it forward, and when I bring my binding strip forward, I want everything to line up perfectly right here in this corner, so I am lined up with the edge of my quilt. When I'm pulling straight back, I want this edge of my binding to be lined up with the edge of my quilt, not the edge of my batting, the actual edge of the quilt top. And that will give me a nice 45-degree angle right here. And then I'm going to pull the binding forward so that when I do that, I am still perfectly lined up down this side right here, and I'm lined up across the top. So I have a perfect little corner right here, and then I'm going to start sewing right at the edge. Do a little back stitch and continue all the way down until I'm 1/4 of an inch away from the next corner, and then I'm going to repeat that process on all the corners. Now once I get all the way around, you can see that this is where I started over here. So I like to stop about 6 to 8 inches away from where I started. So I'm going to continue sewing, and then I'm going to give that a little back stitch, and then I'm going to break my threads, and I will show you how to join this binding continuously. Alright, so we've gone all the way around, and I have left myself a gap of about 6 to 8 inches. But what I really want is only a 2.5 inch overlap. Or, let me just quantify that. Whatever the size of my binding is the size I want my overlap to be. So I'm just going to trim that one right there. Get rid of that. Okay, and from here, I'm going to measure up 2 1/2 inches. So if my binding was 2 1/4, my spacing would be 2 1/4. If my binding was 3 inches, my spacing would be 3 inches. So here I've done 2 1/2 from the end of my binding, and I want this one to also be 2 1/2 inch overlay. So I'm just going to measure out my 2 1/2 inches. Give that one a mark right there, and we are going to just cut that off. So what I have here is 2 1/2 inch overlap right in here because my binding was 2 1/2 inches. Now, I don't think in my original video that the part about joining the binding together actually showed up very well, and it's really important. So I have made a little mock-up here that I'm hoping it'll show it a little bit better and it'll be a little easier to see. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to overlap my strips by 2 1/2 inches because this is 2 1/2 inch binding. So I will line this up on the 2 1/2 inch. I'm just going to put a little mark right there so you can see that's my 2 1/2 inches right there. And I want to cut this binding right on that 2 1/2 inch line so that I have a full 2 1/2 inches of overlap. So I'm just going to go ahead and snip that off. And there we go. That's my 2 1/2 inches of overlap. All right, so here we are ready. So the first time that I saw this done, a little bell went off. It was like, oh my goodness, that is so easy. Why have I been making this so difficult? So here's how easy it is. I've got my 2 pieces. I've got my 2 1/2 inch overlap. I'm going to take this piece. I'm going to open it out like this. So I've just turned it a little bit. I'm going to take this piece and I'm just going to lay it on top. Right sides together. And I'm going to line up the raw edges. So I'm going to line up these raw edges, line up these raw edges. I'm just going to hold that together with a pin. Just like that. And now I'm going to go to the sewing machine and I'm going to sew from this diagonal right here to this diagonal right here. So here we go. I have sewn from corner to corner on that diagonal, and this gives me perfect continuous binding every single time. So my next step now is to trim that down, and you can do it with your rotary cutter or with scissors. I'm just going to dip it across with some scissors. I'm going to press that seam open like so. And then I'm going to go to the sewing machine and I'm going to continue and sew the binding down all the way. And that gives me a beautiful little continuous binding every single time. All you have to do is remember the magic rule. However big your binding is how big your overlap needs to be. So now we're just going to hand sew our binding down. Now generally I like to use a sharps needle for this. A little bit longer. I'm using a heavier needle today so that you can see what I'm doing. I've threaded up my needle with the thread that I'm going to use, and I'm just going to make myself a quilter's knot there and get ready to do this. Now, what we want to do is we want to take that binding and we're going to flip it over so that we cover the line of stitching that we've done right here. Now, if this was a heavier bat, this was a really thin bat in this quilt. If I had used a heavier bat, I will cut it down here so that I'm then even with the edge. I won't leave this extra 1/4 of an inch here that I did on this quilt. I would take that away. And in this instance, I will also trim down my corners. So, I'm going to push this around, and I want to make sure that I'm covering those stitches. So, I'm going to just take my thread here, and I'm sewing somewhere that's going to be covered up by the stitches, so I'm just sewing up above. And I'm going to knot off my thread. Now what I want to do is pull this around so that I'm covering up those stitches. And I'm going to take a small bite just of the backing. I'm not going all the way through, and see a nice tiny little bite of the binding. Then I'm going to go back under and another tiny little bite. So the trick here is wherever I come out, I want to make sure I go in directly where I came out. So let's see if I can get this even closer. I'm going to go in there. So see, I'm coming out right here. And I want to put my needle back in just in the backing, right where I came out. That way it hides your stitches. So even though this thread is a little bit lighter color, I will usually match my binding. I don't want to use a different colored thread. But you can't see those stitches because I am going in directly where I came out. So when I am usually teaching this, I kind of give an analogy, like if I was standing on the top of a cliff and I fell off the cliff, I would fall straight down, assuming I didn't hit any rocks on the way down. I would fall straight down, and that is where you go back in again, and that is what hides your stitches. So you're going to continue all the way to the corner. Now usually I will put no more than about 18 inches of thread on my needle at a time, and I will usually load at least 2 or 3 stitches, holding this down as I go. And when I'm taking the stitches, I'm not going all the way through. I don't want to see any of these stitches on the other side at all. And as I come up to the corner, I am going to continue sewing. I want to hold that corner down, and I want to sew right into that corner. So as I'm holding it, see, I'm sewing past this stitch line because I want to sew all the way to that part of the corner. There we go. Then I'm going to turn this and just push that over and see how that makes a beautiful miter, just like that. And it's pretty much automatic. When you sew into the corner like that, just fold that over and you have a lovely miter. Now I'm going to start sewing right here in the corner, right there, and continue sewing all the way down. And when you flip it back over to the front, you'll see you have a beautiful little miter on the front as well. Now, hand sewing my binding is something that I actually quite enjoy. I find it very relaxing. I have my little side kick down here, sound asleep at my feet, and I can just kind of let my mind wander as I sew down my binding. For those of you who don't like to hand sew your binding, check out my video on machine quilting down your binding, and that'll give you a few tips to get the binding done a whole lot faster, because it is a little bit of a slower process when you hand sew your binding, but it's the relaxation factor that I enjoy the most. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you have enjoyed this video and picked up some helpful hints along the way. Thank you so much for watching. This is Kelley Richardson of Kelley's Creative Comforts. Bye for now and happy sewing.